All the characters in the story are over 18 years old. Look, Mommy, a gorilla! The little girl exclaimed loudly, pointing her finger towards the cage. Her voice cut through the air, attracting the attention of others. Kate, as before, smiled discreetly, although she sighed inwardly. Over the years of working at the zoo, she had heard this phrase so many times that she could write it down in a book of the most popular children's sayings. Can't anyone come up with something original? She thought for the 100th time. Kate leaned on the windowsill, watching the customers outside. Fussy parents were packing up, and the children were reluctant to leave the play areas. Glancing at the crowded exit, she slowly turned around and walked to the back wall of the room. There was an intercom next to her desk where she could make an announcement. Picking up the phone, Kate pressed the button and spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, your visit is coming to an end. The zoo is closed until tomorrow morning. Please leave the area so that the animals can rest and prepare for the new day. Thank you for understanding." Her words, as always, caused a quiet chuckle from those who were nearby. People probably found it funny that animals demanded silence and sleep like moody children. After putting the phone back in its place, Kate dusted off her hands a little and turned to the door. At that moment, Steve came in, a tall, smiling guy she'd been working with for several years. "Hello. Are you planning to join us today?" he asked with a slight smile, tilting his head to the side. "Mr. Myers said there were some problems in the Sarka enclosure," Kate began, looking thoughtfully at her colleague. "He asked me to look in there and figure out what happened." Steve frowned, shaking his head slightly. "I wouldn't go there if I were you," he admitted with a note of apprehension in his voice. "This monkey, it's huge, and to be honest, it seems pretty evil to me." There was a contradiction in his mind. On the one hand, he was really worried about Kate, and on the other, he couldn't help but think about how good she looked even in a simple work uniform. He had wanted to invite her to dinner for a long time, but he couldn't find the right moment. Maybe things will be different today. Kate smiled slightly at his hesitation. "Don't worry, I can handle it," she said. "It seems that Sark treats me well. However, it's not about him, but about the fact that the lighting in the aviary is broken again. Mr. Myers wants me to check out what the problem is." Steve didn't miss the chance to reply with a slight smirk. "Well, if that's the case, I dare not detain you. But what about going out next week?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to pretend that this sentence was random, although in fact he had carefully thought out every word. Kate looked at him with friendly warmth, as if considering his suggestion. Then she nodded. "Of course, next week." Her smile was genuine, and Steve felt a little relieved. Waving goodbye to her, he watched as she headed to the maintenance room to get her tools. Returning to her work, Kate paused at the window for a moment, glancing at the animal cages. Thoughts of the upcoming inspection briefly receded into the background, giving way to a slight pleasant excitement that Steve caused with his attention. After the usual hour or two that she always spent cleaning and putting everything in order at the end of her shift, Kate headed to the ladies' room with a sense of accomplishment. There, near her locker, she took off her usual uniform of a zoo employee, a jacket and trousers, shivering a little from the coolness that always reigned in the room. It seemed to her that this moment was a kind of ritual, to take off not only her work clothes, but also the worries associated with the endless requests of colleagues, the whims of visitors, and unexpected minor incidents. As Kate was changing into her casual clothes, comfortable shorts and shirt, it suddenly occurred to her that she had completely forgotten about Mr. Myers' request. He mentioned that it was necessary to fix the light in Sarka's cage, and, as always, handed over this task to her, as if she were not a zookeeper, but a universal mechanic. Kate frowned, but glancing at her watch, she decided that work could only wait a few minutes. The zoo had been closed to visitors for a long time, and she doubted anyone would be outraged if she did the repairs without changing back into her uniform. Leaving her work clothes and bag in the locker, Kate quickly headed towards the Sarka enclosure. The way there passed through quiet paths illuminated by dim lanterns. The night zoo looked completely different. The sounds of the city remained outside its walls, and all around was the sound of leaves, the occasional footstep, and the barely audible movement of animals in their nooks. Upon reaching the gorilla enclosure, Kate paused briefly at the entrance, looking at the massive cage. The lights really weren't working, and everything was plunged into shadows. This added some drama to the situation, which he tried to ignore. Sighing, she opened the door and went inside. The cage was empty. Sarky was in his sleeping quarters, but even his absence did not remove the feeling that someone was watching her. Kate looked around and once again mentally questioned why Mr. Myers assigned her such tasks so often. Does he think she's a professional electrician? Or does she think that she handles any tool better than any other employee? With these thoughts, she took out a flashlight from her pocket and pointed it towards the problematic lamp. "Well, it's okay," she muttered to herself. The Sarky was an imposing mountain gorilla that awed most of the zoo's staff and visitors. His huge paws and piercing gaze made him formidable even in calm moments. However, it was different with Kate. He seemed to take a special liking to her right away. In her presence, he became almost affectionate. He often hung over her shoulder or even tried to hug her slightly, which looked comical considering his size. Kate always smiled at this behavior, although deep down she remained wary. Today was no exception. As soon as she entered the cage, Sark immediately came closer, studying her movements full of curiosity. He was clearly wondering why she had brought a flashlight and why she had suddenly decided to climb to the ceiling of his enclosure. Kate glanced at the massive platform above. It had been specially installed to serve the lighting fixtures, and despite its height, it looked secure enough. "Well, Sark, don't let me down," she muttered half-jokingly, starting to climb up. The stairs led to a wide platform from where it was possible to reach the lanterns. As soon as Kate climbed on top of her, the gorilla, not wanting to stay away, also began to pull himself closer. His movement was graceful despite his impressive size. Once there, Sarky sat down next to the edge of the platform, carefully watching her actions. Kate couldn't help but laugh. At that moment, the gorilla looked more like a curious child than a formidable inhabitant of the jungle. "Well, thanks for the company," she said, turning to him. In response, Sark tilted his head slightly, as if he was really listening. Kate got to her feet, craning her neck and pointing the flashlight upward to get a better look at the problem. She had to move carefully so as not to lose her balance, because the platform, although spacious, was still at a decent height. The light bulb looked damaged, and she had to replace it with a new one. Meanwhile, Sarky began to move closer, as if checking to see if she was okay. At some point, Kate felt his massive hand lightly touch her hip and tensed. "Sark, not now, okay?" she said softly, trying to remain calm. The gorilla took a step back, as if understanding her request, but did not look away, watching her every move. Kate concentrated on her work, but still glanced at her huge companion from time to time. She couldn't help but think that one of his random moves could knock her off the platform. However, Sarky seemed to understand how unsafe this place was and did not make any harsh gestures. When she finished checking, she breathed a sigh of relief and sat down on the platform next to the gorilla. "Well, buddy, everything's ready," she said, patting him on the shoulder. Sark grunted softly, as if agreeing, and watched her go downstairs. Kate froze, standing on the platform, as if time had stopped. Her heart was pounding, but she knew she couldn't afford to panic. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, she stretched out her hand to the huge paw of the snake, which held her in an uncomfortable position. "Quiet, my friend. Quiet," she murmured, hoping her voice would calm him down. When his fingers touched his arm, Kate gently tried to push it away. But Sark wasn't going to let go. Squeezing his thumb, she twisted it, hoping that this would make the gorilla retreat. The result was the opposite. Sark growled sharply, his eyes flashing with anger. He pushed her with such force that Kate couldn't resist. Her body jerked back, instinctively leaning away from the edge of the platform to avoid falling down. But that only made the situation worse. Losing her balance, she collapsed onto the platform, landing heavily on her stomach. The impact was so strong that it took her breath away. For a few seconds, Kate just lay there, unable to move. Lying there, she realized the danger of the situation. Sark stood up to his full height, showing off all his might. His massive figure loomed over her, and his growls filled the space. Kate froze, her gaze fixed on the gorilla. For a moment, She thought the beast was about to strike. Her mind was frantically searching for a way out of the situation. She had to get out of here, and fast, she thought. But fear held her back. She was trying to figure out why Sark, who had always been so friendly, suddenly became so aggressive. Maybe something happened. Something angered him? Or had she made a wrong move? Kate remembered that she was alone at the zoo. There was no one who could come to her aid. Her only chance of salvation is to act on her own. Gathering her will into a fist, she began to slowly rise, moving to all fours. The plan was simple: get to the stairs and go down without provoking a fight. But that didn't happen. When she barely started to rise, the gorilla took a step forward, blocking the way. His eyes were burning and his breathing was heavy. Kate felt cold sweat trickle down her back. She understood that any wrong move could be her last. Her thoughts slowed down, focusing on only one thing. What could she do to calm him down? She recalled that gorillas are sensitive to tone and behavior. Should I try to calm him down with my voice? Or wait until he calms down? Sitting on her knees, she raised her hands, indicating that she was not going to threaten him. "It's okay, Sark. It's all good." "What is it?" she said in a low, almost whispery voice that almost trembled. But Sarky continued to stand there, studying her. Kate knew that her next step would be crucial. He slowly bent over her, bringing his face closer to hers, and stared straight into her eyes with such genuine curiosity that his gaze seemed to pierce right through her. His pupils dilated, and there was something like sinister interest in his features. Kate screamed, suddenly overcome by a wave of terror, and began to struggle desperately. Her hands came down hard on the monkey's chest, but it only distracted him a little. She squirmed, trying to slip out of the creature's clutches, but its grip was as relentless as a steel vise. No matter how strong her urge for freedom was, this confrontation did not promise her success. The creature, apparently tired of her attempts to escape, suddenly swung and hit Kate in the face. The blow was sharp and strong, so that she staggered, and the pain pierced her consciousness, leaving him in a state of temporary stupor. At that moment, it was as if she had fallen into the void. The shock had completely taken over her mind. Kate frantically tried to collect the remnants of sanity, but fear and horror filled every cell of her body. All thoughts, plans, and feelings disappeared, replaced by the realization of the nightmare that was unfolding in front of her. The creature's gaze, its strength, its ruthlessness, all seemed to carve a single, inescapable truth into her mind. She realized what awaited her, but her mind refused to accept this reality. After all, until that moment, she couldn't even imagine that such a thing was even possible. In the end, they made love. Kate sat with her back pressed against the cold wall and her knees drawn up to her chest. Her head was resting on her folded arms, and her gaze was wandering somewhere in the void. Her thoughts were spinning in a chaotic dance, like leaves blown by the wind. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The events of the last few hours seemed to cut into my mind like a red-hot knife. She was overcome by a sense of hopelessness. Who could she trust? No one would have believed her words. Even if she decided to tell the truth, people would only laugh or, worse, consider her abnormal. Thoughts of loneliness, injustice, and fear filled her soul, weighing heavily on her heart. It seemed that her world had suddenly changed, and it was no longer possible to return to the previous reality. Kate forced herself to stand up and took a deep breath. Her movements were slow and stiff, as if every cell in her body was resisting the need to move on. She walked unsteadily down from the platform, feeling weak in her legs. Every step was difficult for her, as if the ground beneath her feet had become shaky. She went to the locker room, where she slowly changed her clothes, hardly realizing what she was doing. My fingers were trembling, but my thoughts remained in the same place, in the cage with the Sarka, where it all began. As if on autopilot, she left the room, but suddenly stopped at the cage. Her gaze returned to the massive figure of Sarka. The huge animal, noticing her presence, unhurriedly jumped off the platform, as if with a grace unbecoming of its impressive size. It approached the grate, stopping just a few centimeters away from it. His eyes, full of a calm but wary gleam, stared at her. That look, full of hidden meaning, pierced her to her heart again. Kate held her breath. It seemed to her that this was their last meeting. Thoughts about work, colleagues, and plans for the next week suddenly seemed so far away and insignificant. She realized that she was unlikely to be able to appear at the next meeting with Steve or other employees. Everything that seemed important before has now disappeared in a whirlwind of experience. After standing for a few more moments, Kate turned away and left without looking back, feeling like this weight would accompany her for a long time.